Welcome, everyone. We are pleased to have you for Strategex's first ever Ask an Expert webinar. Honestly, we were floored by the tremendous response that we received, and we really appreciate the opportunity to share our knowledge with you. I'm Maggie Graham, Strategex's Vice President of Marketing, and I'd like to personally thank you for spending the next hour with us. And now, a word from our sponsor, who is also our employer, Strategex. Strategex is the premier 80/20 profit and growth consultancy. We help major manufacturing companies achieve profitable market share growth. To date, we've delivered over 300 billion, that's right, billion with a B, dollars in continued operating profit improvement. It's my privilege to introduce our speakers, who are two of the most strategic people I have ever met. First up is Jenn Desrosiers. Jenn has an extensive background in business transformation. She spent over a decade at Illinois Toolworks, or ITW, where she led several complex consolidations and restructuring projects using 80/20 methodology. Since then, she's been with Strategex, where she now leads the 80/20 profit and growth practice, which, under her leadership, has experienced explosive growth. She works with companies across different industries, and her track record speaks for itself. Recently, she helped an automotive client increase their EBITDA by 25% while improving their delivery performance. Next up, we have Carmelle Giblin, who brings over 25 years of experience in financial and analytical leadership. Strategex is truly lucky to have her because she consistently delivers real results using 80/20. She was a vice president and general manager of a global business unit at ITW, and that unit achieved a CAGR of 31%. Later at Ideal Industries, she served on the C-suite, where she helped grow the company beyond $1 billion. But what I find equally impressive is her commitment to developing other leaders, especially women in business. But enough about us. Let's get to you and your questions.
Thank you, Maggie. And thank you all for being here. We were excited with the questions that came through, the registrations. And like you often find, those of you, a lot of you are clients, and those of you that know us well know we don't love a PowerPoint slide. We do a lot without PowerPoint slide and open communication. And so when Carmel and Maggie and I were talking about how to approach this, we said, let's do it office hour style. Let's have a list of questions and ask. And so as Maggie mentioned, less slides, less theory, more discussion and application. So with that in mind, please ask follow-up questions. We'll get to those as they come in, but I'm going to jump right in. And Carmel, I'll ask you one of the first questions we got.
Okay.
So one of the questions was, what data do most businesses need to gather to do an initial analysis of where to start?
So this is an interesting question because the foundation of 80/20 is always based on data. And data is the most relevant part of what we do. And there's a ton of ways to cut the data. But the type of data that I would say we as Strategex initially starts with is, number one, we want to try to understand your P&L and balance sheet over a period of time. So maybe we look at 2 or 3 years, see how your business is trending. We also gather a very detailed transactional data, like what customers are buying what products, and we link those things because we do analysis that says, what are our biggest 8 customers buying? And we want to be able to organize around the 8 customers and 8 products. So we need to understand that. And sometimes if your business is cyclical, like a big capital equipment business, we would need to see that data over multiple years because maybe 1 year doesn't give you a good picture of the real business. So that's initial data. The other thing that we gather data on very early to kind of assess the health of your business is we have a metric that we use at Strategex, which we call the Strategex key ratio. And it is a measure of material margin as the numerator and total employee cost is the denominator. And this measure, particularly when you look at it over a trended period of time, will tell you how well your business is leveraging the team that you have as you continue to grow or shrink, and how do you manage those things. And oftentimes when we see that data, most of our clients, I would say the vast majority of my clients, when you look at that data, that line's really flat, meaning that they did a great job getting to where they started from or where they're going, but they, at some point, something stalled their growth. And a lot of the work we do when we see that trend line is to be able to help them figure out how to juice that growth. And a lot of what Jen and I are actually going to talk about today is how do you apply 80-20 to growth to get that line moving in that trajectory.
Yeah, I see that too. Either their growth has stalled or they're growing, but are so complex that they're adding resources that offset their ability to leverage. And so this trend line is flat.
Or
A quick,
a last thing I would just add to that is you sparked something, Jen, is sometimes they are adding things to grow which are not accretive and they don't realize it. And so if you actually did that key ratio by the segments, you could see some of them are just rocking it out of the park while others are just not. And that's oftentimes why that line in total is flat.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's important. So we look at the data in all of those quantitative ways. And to Carmelle's point, we want to apply it. We look at it in aggregate. We also want to apply it in the segments where there's a discrete strategy that we need to deploy because they might have different stories. The other areas where we collect data, and maybe you were going to go there, but it came to mind, are some of the qualitative areas. So yes, you want to know the existing jumping off point quantitatively in your business. What is your financial performance? What do your metrics look like today? But also qualitatively, we do a voice of customer. And we suggest you do this too. How are you doing serving your top customers today? That not only will expose areas of risk in the business, but also opportunities for growth. Because ultimately, 80-20 is about profitable market share growth. It's not about cutting. And so early on, yes, you're going to look at the complexity in the business, but we better have a good path and idea of where are we going to invest the resources we're freeing up for growth. So we'll do qualitative voice of customer. Similarly, something we do, and if you're thinking about it as well, taking it on entrepreneurially in your business, we do key management interviews also. So we talk to the leadership team. 80-20 requires a cultural change. And so part of that change management is we need to understand how the teams align today on the strategy, where this is going to integrate really well with what you do today, and where it's going to be uncomfortable naturally for your team. So we have those one-on-one conversations. Carmelle, I don't know about you. Sometimes when we do those, I kind of feel like the Bobs from, oh golly, what's that movie? Office Space.
Yes.
Yes. But now the outcome is not the same outcome as the Bobs from Office Space, but it is to understand, where is this going to work really well?
Okay. I have a follow-up question here. This is from Cheris. How do you know what portion of the key ratio is a result of internal complexities unrelated to a single portion of the business being analyzed?
So, great question, Karis. First thing I will say is when we do the key ratio, we do it initially in total for the whole business, and that ties to your P&L. It's very simple, it's very clear. But when we start to segment the business, and I know you care, so I know in your business we segment it 2 or 3 ways. And once you start to segment the business, the key ratio becomes murkier because your accounting is not clean, right? And so what we try to do when we do this work is we do a zero up financials. We start the financials with like a clean sheet of paper, like assuming that's the only business we had to run, and say what resources do we need to support that segment of the business. And from that zero up P&L, then we can recalculate the key ratio for that segment. Oftentimes, if we just use the key ratio data from your system, there's lots of allocations in there. There's lots of people spread between different businesses, and it becomes unclear what the real key ratio is. And so to really get our arms around this, we zero up those individual segments so we can really understand what the profitability of each individual segment is, and hence the key ratio makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Awesome. So those are the initial analysis areas that I would say that where we start. There was another follow-up question. What data do we need to gather to understand the complexity in our factories?
So the factory is a little different spin for me because I love the factory personally. I spend a lot of time in your factories, but when you 80/20 by revenue, you often lose sight of, from a factory perspective, of where we want to focus. So if I'm running a factory and I'm in the shoes of the factory and I'm in the shoes of the business leader in that factory, I want to understand the 80/20 by volume because the amount of pieces I produce of something becomes a lot more important to me than the revenue itself. So I have this concept, I don't even know if everyone at Strategex uses this, but this is my own personal concept, where I 80/20 by revenue, and I call it A or B by math. Then I 80/20 the same data set by volume, and I call that A and B by math. And if it's an A for commercial revenue and an A for the factory, I call that a super A. And that means that I got to really organize around that in my factory because it's a really important product for my factory, but it's also really important to my revenue. And I got to make sure I get that right. If it's A or B, like mix, A for commercial, B for factory volume, then it's still an A to me, but it's not as important as a super A. And vice versa, because sometimes you might have something super high volume in your factory. Like let's say you're making a fastener that's very inexpensive, but it's really, really important to an A product. It might not be an A for your commercial revenue, but it's really important in your factory. So you have to sort of understand those nuances. So that's the initial cut of data I always do is I look at it by revenue and then or by volume. And then the next thing I will say is I pick the number one product that is the most important super A. And I try to run that through my factory, right? Map it in my mind, like starting from the beginning to end. How do we do it today? And if I could just make that run like beautifully like water, perfectly through your factory, I had no constraints, how would I organize around that? And once we can figure out how to organize around one product, the question I always get is, how's that scalable? Well, then we can start, going product by product through starting with the super A's all the way down through your factory. And eventually it might take a couple of years, but over time, you've 80/20 that whole factory and you've really gotten organized around your customers.
I love that. I love the example you picked there on, often the resistance or feedback, not resistance, but feedback is, okay, but how is that scalable if I start with one? And the truth is, I would ask the question counter, which is, how are we going to possibly get everything to perfect simultaneously? We can't boil the ocean. So picking one and doing just that one to perfect, or organizing a model cell to picking a super A, as you just explained it, high volume and high revenue, and saying the cell in which this is manufactured, I want this to be a model cell and perfectly execute that super A is a good way to get a quick win and traction. And then through that, I promise you'll learn things that will scale to other parts of the cells and operations. To offer another counter perspective to that, Carmelle and I, we debate and align, and we love working accounts together. And it's been a while since we have, but she approaches it always with the data first. I do too. And the only addition I would offer to the super A's using the volume and revenue would be, is there a quick win culturally that you need to get your arms around in the factory? So the other data point I would gather is walking through the shop floor. Is there an area that someone passes every single day that is an unacceptable example of what we want the future state to look like? So I've had a couple clients. I think of one that I worked with in just outside Atlanta and Fairburn, and the common path into the factory was past a really small support cell that was rusted, cobwebbed, poorly kept, terrible 5S. And, we were walking the shop floor with the president, and we said, just pause and ask yourself, the person who was working here last, what is the last thing that happened here? What is the last thing that happened in the cell? That they dropped these tools, disorganized, and they said, good enough, and walked out the door. And everyone walks by this every day, and we're telling them that that's okay. So yes, you want to pick, to Carmelle's point, a data-driven approach that is meaningful to your economics as a business, but sometimes you also want to pick a cultural approach and say, I'm going to fix the break room first, and that's going to be my model cell. Or in the case of that client in Atlanta, we fixed that very small cell because everyone passes it every day. Also, bathrooms are a good one. If your shop floor bathrooms don't look good, let's fix that right away. Sorry, Maggie, I see you. Did someone else come ask a
Of
question?
course. This question is from Eric. Follow up on the factory volume analysis. Is that by units or labor hours or some other metric?
By units. The reason I wouldn't, I mean, sometimes I also include labor hours just so I can have the data in my analysis. But labor hours in often cases in most of my clients are theoretical. They're not actual labor hours. Like at ITW, labor would be charged directly to a cell, and you know exactly how many people are working on it, and it would just be a very direct cost. Most of my clients have a theoretical labor hour number, which they are doing based on some engineering study or some kind of historical analysis. And oftentimes that's not true. And so I try to stick with what I know to be true, and how many units I produce in that cell tends to be the best way to get my head around how I want to organize around the volume. Although I will add to that, if there is a cell, like one of my last client I just had one cell of their business that had a disproportionate amount of their labor dollars attached to it. And so we didn't pick it first. We picked their highest volume first to 80/20, but we got to it second because we knew there would be a pretty large impact of improving the labor situation in that cell. So understanding the dynamic of the actual labor cost associated with the cell you're starting with definitely does go into your strategic thinking of how you want to apply it.
Okay, well, and we got one more question on data clarification. So if you serve diverse markets, should the customer ranks be determined by the sales volume of the total population, or should the customers be segmented based on profiles of certain markets and applicable sales volume create ranks for the applicable market profiles?
So that's a great question, Jen. So I think that you could do it both ways. And I always start with the total business. Who's my real 80? That's the big mathematical 80. But sometimes when you're doing most of our clients now are big multinational companies. Sometimes that they have markets that don't have global customers, for example. So let's say I've got a market in the Mideast, and I've got all these Mideast customers that are not shared with any other parts of the business. Then my 80/20 needs to be for them. Like otherwise you're going to be focused on things that don't matter. And the other way I would look at it kind of conversely is, what if you just focus, like one of my first clients at Strategex had a deal where they said, if it's an A somewhere, it's an A. And that was really challenging to manage because when you do that, everything's an A really. And so as you're trying to organize in one part of the business where it's not really an A for them, but it's an A in Europe somewhere, and all of a sudden they get an order from this effectively B customer, then they're having to treat every one of those like an A. Eventually you don't have a real 80/20 anymore and you can't focus on anything. So I look at it both ways. I look at both sets of data, but the strategy of how to implement it will depend on the business itself, the type of customers you have, the market you're in. And based on all of these factors, we would apply 80/20 based on what we think makes the most sense. That's also why there's no cookie cutter approach to 80/20. You can't just do a book and everybody does it the same way. You really have to look at the dynamics of this.
Yep, I totally agree. All right, moving on. Why is it important to simplify first to achieve transformative growth?
That's a great question. I love it because a lot of people equate 80/20 with just simplification. They think 80/20 is about simplifying, and simplifying for the sake of simplifying is not really that valuable. Yes. And so I always start with this concept of what's our strategy? Like, what are we trying to go do? Like, what is the business trying to accomplish? And when you have a clear vision of what that is the complexity in your customers or products or business holding you back? If the answer is no, I wouldn't even be worried about simplifying. I would be spending all my time figuring out how I'm going to grow that business. If it is holding you back, which usually it is almost every time, then you have to say, what am I going to do to stop letting the B products and B customers affect the growth of my big customers and my big markets? And when those things are holding you back, you've got to deal with them. But I also think that if you can identify, like we have this concept of the quads where we do an analysis where we say A customers on one axis and AB customers on one axis, AB products on the other, and we intersect them. So there's like a quad 4, which is B products that are being bought by A customer or B customers, B customers, B products. When you've got a bunch of people in your organization running around only focused on those bought 4 products and customers, that is holding you back from growth. So identifying what those are to be able to redirect those resources towards something that's actually going to be valuable for your business, that's also going to always be something that you want to try to understand.
Yeah. And we understand this really well in our personal lives, I will say. From a cognitive bandwidth perspective, we know that our brain is like a computer and we can't run a high performance program if we have too many tabs open. That is true for our business too. We need to focus so that we can be high performing in the few things that are exceptionally important to the business. And Maggie, I know you want to say something, but I'm on a roll with personal analogies. I am traveling back right now from Europe. I'm in the UK this week, but last week I was in Spain with my dad. For a milestone birthday, we hiked part of the Camino. And as we were preparing for the trip and packing, my dad wanted to carry a duffel bag. I was like, Dad, what are you talking about? Like, we need to lighten the load here. No one would climb Everest with a pack full of junk on their back. And the same exact thing is true for, we weren't climbing Everest, but it was true for our 10-mile walk every day for the week that we did it. But the same is true for our businesses as we grow. The higher we ascend, the more critical it becomes to shed the weight and focus on the things that matter. So that's why I would say you got to simplify so we can transformatively grow. Maggie.
I love that analogy. As we ascend, we have to shed the weight to grow.
She's mocking
Beautiful.
me.
I have actually 2 questions, okay? And it's actually 3 in 2. So, from someone who would like to remain anonymous, how do you achieve 80/20 strategy methodology in a company that doesn't want to treat their customers like a number, and a company where every customer is unique and everything seems to be an exception? As a follow-up, again, from the anonymous attendee, what are some talking points to convince leadership that part of growing and maturing as a company is to look at segmentation and tail management? So answer that, and I'll be back with the next one.
I'm going to answer the second question first. So how do we convince management that it's important to do the segmentation?
Mhm.
The way I find the most easiest way to convince anyone of anything, and it's something that we have to do every day in Strategex, is we use an unemotional data approach. Like when you have data that's unemotional and is clear, it's a lot easier than anecdotally having a conversation about why something's really. And so if I was going to segment the business in a way that made sense, I would say, what is the markets I'm going to segment around, or how am I segmenting, and what is the strategy for the why that's true? And then I would zero up that business unit saying, if I was going to achieve this strategy, what resources do I need to do that? So what does that P&L look like? And then you can have data when you go to your management and say, look at these businesses. There's 4 businesses. One of them is losing money and has been for a long time. And when you really put the costs where they go, this business is not helping us grow, or this business unit that we've all been organized around forever, we have a really high market share, and the opportunity to grow in this is not going to be as great. And so for me to take my limited resources and team, I want to refocus them on growth engines and markets where I know I can have a big impact to my bottom line and top line. And it might meaning milking and holding some segments and taking resources out of them. And it might mean discontinuing whole segments altogether because they're just a drag on our resources. One of my first clients, I love this example, is they had a lot of market share in their business that they were in. And it was a tight market. There were only 2 competitors. It was a really highly regulated market, and they owned the market share. And they're owned by this private equity company, and they had this mantra that you had to grow. And how do you grow when you own all the market share? So they decided they were going to grow in an adjacent market that was similar but different, right? Different customers. And so in the process of doing this, they realized to win in this adjacent market, their technology just wasn't right, wasn't perfect. They needed engineering. So they started adding engineers to develop the products better and adding costs to deal with this. And over time, they had a little bit of growth from this, but their bottom line was getting worse and worse and worse. And ironically, until we actually went in and did the segmentation and said, here's how much money you're making on your core business. Here's how much you're making on this new business thing that you've been trying to do for 4 years. You have grown the business, might be multi-millions of dollars, but the resources and costs to do this, you actually are losing money. When we did this analysis, first thing they did was sell off that business because it was not profitable and it wasn't going to be profitable. And to find avenues to grow for them, they had to find totally different ways to do it without having to add all the costs. That's why this key ratio by segment totally matters. Because what happened is if you looked at the key ratio was great for the core business, maybe it's a little flat, but totally bad for the other. And it definitely does inform how you think about that. So I hope I answered that question. Maggie, now that I've talked for too long, I forgot the first
I'll take
question.
a crack. I'll take a crack at the first one. I knew when you said you were going second, I was like, I better remember the first. So we worked together too long. But the question was around a company that doesn't want to treat their customers like a number, and where every customer is unique. And to that, I would say you're not alone in that sentiment. And I want to help influence and challenge it. As a business leader, of our constituents, the customer is one group, but we have a couple others. I would say most importantly, we have a constituency of our people and our team. So who are our people? Who are our team? As a company, we have a responsibility to them. Two is the customer, that they are a key constituent in our ability to operate. And then a third is who are our shareholders or stakeholders. Of course, this is going to be different if you're private or public, family, or the dynamics, but who are your owners? So your constituents are a balance of, am I doing the right thing for my team, my people? Am I doing the right thing for my customers? And am I doing the right thing for my owners? And so if you can have a balanced perspective there, it starts to work out this worry that how do I overserve every customer? Well, if you overserve and make a custom solution for every single customer that wants to buy from you, you're probably not doing the right thing for your people. They're going to be stretched too thin, overworked, under pressure, risk of burnout, and frankly, in a manufacturing environment, that's what leads to upset conditions and safety concerns. So not a balanced perspective there. Similarly, if we want to serve every customer uniquely to their own solution, we're not going to do the right thing by our owners either, because we know that there will be an inflection point where we take on one more customer with one more custom solution that is actually decremental or decretive to the value. So I think trying to reframe that we have three constituents that we're really responsible for will help treat us. And then for those customers you do choose to keep, and even if you're bespoke, 80/20 works for fully bespoke businesses. We have lots of examples. Now I can be exceptional at making sure each of those customers that buy from us, I can serve very, very well. So that would be my approach to reframe the concern there.
Great. Okay, this second question is from Joe. What helpful tips do you have to ensure the business doesn't go back over time to increased Q4, quad 4, while allowing growth for potential new baby whales?
It's really, really important. And one of the first things we do when we simplify is we create filters, right? So we say we have to have a filter that says we have a very clear definition of what it takes to be in the club. What does it take to be a customer? What does it take to be a product in our business? And what are the rules around that? And it makes it a lot harder for all this noise to creep back in. But having said that, let's say you have an example of something that is a B customer today, but they come in with some massive opportunity or new order, and your filter process isn't working for that customer. Most of the time, what would happen is it doesn't just get kicked out and say, we're not going to deal with this baby whale that might end up being big for us. Through the process of approvals that we set up through the filter process, it will kick up to somebody who will recognize this as a big enough business opportunity that they'll pull it out and say, okay, I might want to treat this B product or B customer like an A. But to do that, and my personal rules are, if I'm going to kick something out that's mathematically a B, it should be an A, it has to have two things. You have to have a written down specific strategy that you're actually going to do something differently with it, with different resources, different plans. And two is you have to have a very clear definition of an ejection point that says in the beginning, I'm going to treat this like an A with this strategy, but if it doesn't work by this date, it gets kicked back to B, I pull the resource. Because there's somebody actually on this call right now that we had this exact example where they had invested a lot of resources in something that was a pet project of their leader that had pretty good opportunity, but it was never ever profitable for many years, and they just kept pouring more and more resources into it. And eventually, as we zeroed it up, we realized very quickly this thing is just never going to, if we had set an ejection point, we probably would have cut the thing out 2 years ago. Instead, we were throwing more and more money into it. And with data, it was pretty obvious to say, you got to exit this thing. But if you write that ejection point in the beginning, you take kind of the emotion out of it, and it becomes a black and white conversation. I don't know, Jen, if you have anything more you want to add.
I know. I think that's perfect. On you want to make strategic bets on baby whales that are going to grow up to be a top whale. And so what you outlined there, Carmel, I fully agree with. The other thing I would say is how to, specifically to the part of the question that was how do we reduce creep coming back in quad four? This is where metrics and governance is important. What gets measured gets accomplished. And so are you running your quads and quartiles on a routine cadence and making it part of internal audit and business planning to make sure? Don't wait 3 years to run it again and all of a sudden, the huge vacuum has returned. So yeah, that's all I would add.
Good point.
All right. So another question that we received in advance, how do we identify areas where the business is investing heavily with very little return?
We've talked about a little bit already on this call, but it really gets into segmenting your business, understanding the different segments that we're in, and doing this zero up financial statement where you're saying, how should we be organized to go win here? And then I bump that up against how are we actually organized? Like sometimes like the ideal way to organize is not the way you organize today. And there's tons more resources assigned to it. And so what it allows you to do is say, if I really wanted to win with this segment and I was organized in this way to win with these types of resources, and maybe that even means I don't have the right talent in my organization to meet this need. I have to go outside to go get it. But if I had that, I think I could do it very profitably. But instead, I've got these 19 people associated with this thing, and it's a slog, and it's not growing, and it's holding me back. So I wouldn't just cut it just because it made no sense today. I would really try to understand both the strategy, what would it take to actually win? And does it make sense to put our resources here? Is this the best opportunity for us to grow? Or is there a better one in one of these other segments? And I do want to think differently about this whole thing. But when people just put costs, particularly allocated costs across multiple segments, you lose sight of those insights. And so what we do as Strategex is we go into your business and we help you think through what are the right segments? What is your strategy? What are the market dynamics for those strategies? And what makes sense to organize around? And then we help you figure out how to put the resources against it. I had a client literally last night that challenged me because he wanted to jump to resource. Why aren't we resourcing first? Why don't we get to the zero up? What do we mean that's going to take 2 months to zero this up? And I will fight this till I'm dead. You have to have the right data. You have to understand the market conditions. You have to understand the strategy. If you skip all those steps and just jump to how do I organize? I mean, structure, follow strategy every time.
I was going to say it. Yeah.
That's what it is. And then people that jump to, Carmelle, hurry up and resource this so I can cut costs faster. You're skipping the part that makes you great. And that's what we can't let you do.
Absolutely. When we do this with clients and when we sub-segment and try to understand through assigned financial data and assigned costs, and then looking at a future state of what it would look like, how we would leverage, do we like that profit better? We really encourage everyone to be brave on paper. So the worst that can happen is you hate it and you ball it up and throw it in the trash can in the corner. But get a small group together that's not afraid or constrained of the current state and say, what is possible if I build this from a clean sheet of paper up? And the other thing I will say is when you do this, Carmelle, I don't know if you find this, but so often the first time I'm doing this with a new client, what I see is everyone wants their segment to be a growth segment. And so the truth is we have limited resources, limited capital, and everyone's growth ideas are competing. And so just realize going in, not everything will get funded equally. And that's part of 80/20. So get the data, segment, determine which segments are most profitable today, which have a vision to be the most accretive to our goals in the future, and then not everyone can get the resources. That's just the way it
The
works.
only follow-up I will also add, Jen, and when I've done this for multiple businesses now, what I find is their biggest growth opportunities are grossly under-resourced.
I
Most
agree.
people under-resource their biggest opportunities because they're spreading their people to all this stuff that doesn't matter. And when you really do these segmentations, they're up and you say, I'm going to make my bet here and I'm going to put these people on this thing. And I think when I focus here, I'm really going to be able to go win. We find that we win so much faster, goes so much better. And you could do it without adding any cost because you're shifting the labor around and you're putting the people where you're going to have you're making your biggest bets. And with a good injection point and a good strategy, all of a sudden you start making decisions. Not everything you decide to do is going to win, but if you've got all the bones of it in place, you're going to have a lot better success than what you're usually what you're doing today.
I have an example of that specific to innovation and a client that I worked with. You just reminded me of it talking about it. I had this client that everything was bespoke. It was a total custom business. And when we first went over this concept, their head of innovation and technology said, I wonder what it would look like if I created a quad of the innovation NPD pipeline. And so they took all the existing products and projects in the pipeline and said, where would it be if it reached its growth potential at commercialization? And simultaneously, this was a Q1 kickoff with this client. We did a pulse survey of their engineering team. You know, I always like to balance the financials with the cultural story. Well, the pulse survey came back and said 22 out of 22 of our product development engineers say that we're overworked, they're out of capacity, and they're at risk of burnout. And so his name was Brandon, took this quad data and that feedback, qualitative data from his team, and he said something's got to change. And he completely cut what was a 50% of the total projects. He took out 50% of the total projects, and it only decreased the value of the pipeline by 8%. So 50% fewer products because they were all going to come out in quad four. And it only took the value of the pipeline down 8%. So the product development engineers went from having on average 40 projects each to 19 projects each and retained pretty much all the value. We tracked throughput, vitality, everything started to commercialize and come to market faster. And within 1 quarter, we did another pulse survey of engagement of the team. The response, the same number, 22 product development engineers, the response to the question, how many of you are at risk of burnout? And only 2 responded that they were.
That's
And
fantastic. That's
and so
awesome.
that's the power of really simplifying and organizing around the few things and getting rid of the complexity.
That's also a great example, Jen, of how you apply 80/20 outside of revenue and customers, where you really start thinking about how do I 80/20 any part of my business to get focused and organized. That's just a perfect example of that, where often people stop at their product and customer.
Right. Yeah. No, and it applies to every single function. Okay, another follow-up question. Ooh, how do I identify what is worth keeping in quad 4 and when to monitor versus action?
So this is where it's challenging because if you just were going to do a cookie cutter approach to 80/20, you'd probably put a big X in quad 4 and say, I want to get out of these products or all these customers, or I'm going to price this all up significantly, or just ignore it. But the devil's always in the details. So we try to get an understanding of, are there some baby whales sitting in quad 4 that we want to organize around? And maybe we'll give you a couple to work on. And you just follow the same rules. It has to have a strategy. It has to have an ejection point. But sometimes there are stuff sitting in there. Like, for example, let's say you've got some big, huge customer that it has their exact biggest competitor sitting in your quad 4 because they're buying from your competitor most of the time. Well, that might be some example where I want to focus on this customer because I know it could be as big as my biggest customer. We just haven't resourced it right. We haven't done something right to make it true. So we need our strategy to change if we're going to get that to grow. But the risk is, and I had one client that had 150 of these things. I mean, the risk is you can pick too many and you don't have enough resources to do too many. To Jen's example, you could have as many things as you wanted to work on if you had unlimited resources. But the whole point of the key ratio is to say, we can't invest in every little thing. We've got to figure out where to spend our resources and put them on the right things. And so if you're going to pick something off from quad 4 at the expense of putting resources to grow your quad 1, you better have a very good strategy. It better make some sense. And you can't have too many.
it better be able to be quad 1 potential.
Yeah.
I think to be really clear, the bias is we don't want quad 4. Where you can pick out a couple strategic bets to place them, but have the ejection point that you talked about earlier. And the other thing I will say, I have a client that I'm currently working with that so the devil is in the details, right? The bias is no quad 4 with an asterisk of if you remove it, you better be able to take the cost out associated with it. Otherwise, all you have done is damage your margin and bottom line.
Right.
And so I have a client I'm currently working with right now that the market's down right now. Globally, their volume is just contracting in the industry. Not losing share, just down market. They know they don't want their quad 4. They have made right sizing overhead decisions and footprint consolidations. But the remaining quad 4, they've isolated it. They're treating it differently in their factories, running it on a different schedule, on different assets. And they know exactly, what they want to get rid of, but they're going to wait till they replace it with a quad 1 win. So, there is some nuance and timing, but be clear about the goal. We don't want it.
Right.
Okay, what experience do you have doing reverse quad analysis for supply chain alignment to core products and core customers?
You want to take that one, Jen?
Yeah, I can take that one. So the question is doing reverse quad analysis for supply chain to align core products and core customers. All right, I'm going to answer this the way I interpret it. And if I didn't get it right, ask a follow-up question, please. So the way I would interpret this question is we talk about making the quad from our finished good products perspective and our customers' perspective. But maybe I'm in supply chain or procurement, and I want to understand how I 80/20 my activities based on that quad. Again, let's go for widget manufacturing. You might have a finished good that is an A product. It's a high mover. I sell a lot of it. And it might be made up of a whole bunch of subcomponents. Some of those subcomponents are A's for you in procurement, but some of those subcomponents might be B's for you. Even though it goes into a finished good A product, every single one of those subcomponents or raw materials needs to be treated strategically because it's essential to executing your quad 1A finished good. So when we work backwards through our supply chain, we first start with the finished good. We simplify around that, organize around what we want to do really well, which is always quad 1. We want to be world class in quad 1. Then you move back to what subcomponents does that imply I need to be world class in? Then move back further to what raw materials would that imply I need to be world class in? So that's how I interpret the question and how we apply it. We can also apply it that way to our suppliers. We can do a quad by our suppliers as well.
Can I add a follow-up to that, Jen? Because
Yeah.
you triggered something in my thought process. And the thing that's throwing me personally, I don't know, maybe it's throwing you. I don't know what reverse quad 4 means. So if you can, whoever asked the question, clarify what you mean by it. But I would say that I have a business unit that we actually Strategex has 2 clients in this space, but that are in the data center cooling market that's growing like an exponential pace, right? It's growing so fast. And we don't want to get left behind in this space where we're a supplier to this industry that's growing exponentially. And what we found with these clients is that what's holding them back, universally, is their supply chain. Their supply chain is holding them back from being able to participate in an explosive growth market. And so figuring out who are the most important suppliers that are going to be partners with you, that are going to be lockstep with you, that have the resources to support this explosive growth, even if you have to change long-term partnerships to get there, it is a critical part of what we've had to do to go win. And it's not easy. I mean, believe me, it's not easy. But when you're in an industry that's growing exponentially and you've got a supply chain that's holding you back, if that becomes your aid, you got to really isolate that and think about that. So I thought about that when you said that.
Okay, I have some clarity on what reverse quad 4 means, folks.
Okay, good.
It is replacing customers with suppliers and making sure suppliers are aligned to support regular Quad 1 customers.
Okay,
So that,
perfect.
so that's sort of how you answered it then, Jen. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, yeah. So yes, we do, if we are in procurement, want to look at our suppliers and map them, not just in the order of our purchase from them, but making sure we understand which subcomponents we buy from them and what finished good products it goes into what we make so that we can deliver on our quad one ultimately.
So I kind of, as we're talking about supply chain, it might be a good opportunity to kind of interject some thoughts on tariffs, because I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of supply chain tariff stuff. And, we spent, I don't know about you, Jen, but I spent a fair bit of time with my clients early in this year, just helping them jig their financials around what do I do when I have these tariff implications, and the tariffs were changing very dramatically every week. And so I would just want to say a couple things on tariffs. Is number one, the ITW rule was you always produce things in the market that you sell it. So then you don't have supply chain risk, you don't have exchange rate risk, you just have a very organized thing. And if you could make that true for your 80s, that's your first thing, and then you don't have a tariff. But let's say you don't have that. You've decided over the years that you're going to go source your product components that are critical for your A products from an overseas source that now is subject to tariffs and also subject to supply chain risk and subject to risk with transportation and currency. Well, you've made that decision because at the time it made sense financially. Now you got to go back and say, does it still make sense financially? I mean, does it still make sense if given the fact that now my tariff number makes this way more expensive? And so at the very least, I would tell you, if you have an 80 product that's important for your 80 customer, at least dual source it, at least have a source that's local as well, so you have options. And if you don't have that today, I would move towards it, because that's really where I think it's going to protect yourself in the long.
Yep, I agree. Carmelle, I smiled because your CFO hat came on when I heard you talking about all the risks. You're like, if you have chosen to have currency risk and transportation risk and tariff exposure risk, and I was like, oh, here's Carmelle, the CFO. No, yeah, I agree. That is, again, our objective. We need to be world-class suppliers of our Quad 1, which means to whatever extent possible, we want to insource that. We want to be experts in it. And yeah, I think looking for less risk in the continuity of supply of those is a best practice with 80/20 and these tariffs. So another question, when we think about 80/20, we often think about cutting. We've hit this a little. When we think about 80/20, we often think about cutting. How does it 80/20 apply to growth?
So even in businesses that are not, so kind of one of the first analysis that we do is we try to understand, is your business profitable or not in total? And is it profitable or not in these segments? And some segments we're going to say are growth segments, some are not. So even if your business is, let's say, returning less than the cost of capital, and if you are returning less than the cost of capital, your job is not to grow, your job is to fix that problem. Even in those businesses, we do start thinking about growth pretty early, because growth takes time. And so we might say we're going to invest a bunch of time in the beginning for that business, focused on improving margins and reducing costs, because we know we have to, that's our job in the beginning. But we know we're going to do that pretty fast because we're good at that piece. And then we're going to say there's going to be a point where we're going to now be at a margin thing where we're going to have to pivot to growth. And so we don't want to be that's when we're starting growth. We want to start thinking about earlier how we're going to do this. And Jenn and I actually worked together on writing a whole separate Strategex module on how do we use 80/20 to grow. And we've now applied this in multiple businesses, and it's been so fun to see this come to fruition. But it's really about figuring out what are the key markets we want to be in, getting data around that, doing some voice of customer, really understanding the needs of these customers so we can develop a value proposition and get organized around a couple opportunities, not a lot of stuff, a couple big ones, even at the same time that we're doing cutting. So we use 80/20 to figure out how do we 80/20 the opportunities, how do we focus on what we want to focus on, and how do we resource those things properly so we can start to see your business growing, even in a business returning less than the cost of capital. If you're a business that's like cranking, making 40% operating income, our whole job is to grow. And so the whole strategy of the whole engagement will be, how do we help you grow? How do we get organized to grow? What is holding you back from growing? And often your factories are holding you back. Your factory is can't support the growth, or you think that you need a second factory to grow when you're making all these B products that don't make any sense. And we can help you do that more profitably, really. And so once we decide what we're going to strategy around, what we're going to organize around, then we say what pieces of the business are holding us back from growing. And that's where we're going to get ourselves organized. We might have whole teams focused on improving your factory or getting your product line simplified because just this tail of products is killing you. But it all leads back to what's the plan.
A follow-up question came in. Has Strategex developed new 80/20 strategies to get organic sales growth in the low growth industrial market? And to that, my first question back, I mentioned that client that I'm working with currently, whose market is contracting right now. It's completely shrinking. So it's not just low growth, it is on the decline. And my first question to them and to you would be, what is your market share? Carmelle, what is your market share? Because if you tell me your market share is 30%, it's irrelevant that your market's not growing fast. We need to identify the 70% we don't have. There's some whales in there. Form a resource group around it, dedicate the people, and let's go win and target those. So by and large, your market growth or contraction should not be a material driver in your business performance. It affects the baseline. There's some noise there. We don't want to slide back and share, but unless you have 85+% share, it's really a false, it's a false resistance to why we're not growing. Would you add anything to that, Carmelle?
The only thing I would add is, what if you do have 85% share in the market's contracting? Then that becomes, maybe it's all, you got to do it even quicker, is how do I find new market out? How do I define my market bigger? Yeah, how do I find some adjacency to be able to grow in this? Because otherwise, the only other option is, how do I cut costs fast enough to not lose margin while I'm shrinking? And so that's not fun. Yeah. So if we want to figure out how we're going to grow, we probably have to take some of those resources and direct them. But we've got to define the market bigger. My current client has a lot of business in the cannabis industry, and that market shot up, and then it's peaked, and then it declined, and now it's like in a stable kind of place. But their whole business was organized around that, and now they're saying, okay, how do I take these products in different markets? Where are the bigger opportunities? And that's where we have to put some work into understanding how to do that. Because if you just say focus on the thing that it is, where you have a lot of market share, you're going to just be up and down with the market conditions, and you don't want to be subject to that. So you really do have to understand that thing.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And that comes to knowing our core competencies, our value proposition, and then looking for either market adjacencies or product adjacencies to either increase our basket of offering or grow in an adjacent market. That's, yeah, absolutely good add there.
All right, quick follow-up from Karis. At what market share should you begin to consider if it is time to expand to adjacencies?
I don't think there's a fixed number in my mind. It really depends on the market conditions. But Jen used a number of 30%, meaning there's still lots of opportunity at 30%. After 50%, it's hard to grow. I mean, so it's not possible, but harder. So if I was going to look at market adjacencies, as I getting closer to 50% market share, then I would be looking at, I need to expand the size of my market, because that's a big number to me. It's interesting because in the case of the person who asked the question, they have a lot of market share if you define the product as having a lot of share compared to a competitor. But their biggest opportunity is to put their product in places where no one's using it at all, and there is no competitor. And so if you define the market as, where do I have competing business, you have a lot of share. If you define the market as, how about I win all this business for people that aren't using the product at all, then the competitors become irrelevant, and all of a sudden the market opportunity is enormous. And so how you define that market absolutely will define the share. And most times I see people define their market way too small.
I see that too, for sure. The other thing I would say is something you can action on that is model it. It's not one size fits all, but see where your inflection point is. At what point does adding, and do it by specific customers, adding specific customers to grow share materially. At what point do I have to add so many resources that it's actually decretive to my business? And that can be a financially driven way to decide where I look for adjacencies or if I continue to grow in the same space. I will double down that on Carmel's point that often we hear the market's defined too narrowly. So challenge your
And
perspective.
you have a good example though, where you had a client that wasn't profitable or declining in profitability, and you did do this inflection point zero up where you added one customer at a time. Like, where do we talk about that?
Yeah, that is one of my favorite approaches. And this worked it works in a concentrated market. So they were declining in profitability, they had operational constraints, and we needed to understand what was the right base of business for them to keep. So we took their first customer, their largest customer, that was 25% of their revenue, and we said, what if this was the only business you had? And we assigned the resources, the footprint, the assets that would be required to support just that. And then we said, okay, what if we add customer number two? What levers, where are incremental investments that need to be made? And we continued down that path until eventually we inflected and we said, okay, now adding this next tranche of customers requires so much cost to serve that it's decremental. Do we like that or not? And I will tell you, we never stop right at the top of the inflection point. You do come down a little. You add a few more because that gives you flexibility to trade up for other things eventually. And so you just need to find where the right spot is for you. Again, keep in mind those three constituents, your customer, your owners, and your people, and make that strategic and values-based decision. But yeah, I would try some modeling to decide what the right amount is for you.
Okay, you think you can squeeze in one more question? I think you
Yes.
can. How
We'll
can a
try.
mature 80/20 company keep the approach fresh and prevent it from becoming stagnant?
That's a great question.
So ITW's done it for a lot of years. I mean, I think they started in 1982 doing 80/20. I started there in 1992, and it was all in every part of our DNA, and it still is today. So I can honestly tell you, you can do it over multiple decades. The kind of best practices I would say is the leadership team has to be committed. It has to be real. There has to be consistent 80/20 training in your business. So people coming in new to the business are trained in these methods and understand what we're trying to do. Like ITW, I was part of a team that put together an e-learning modules in 80/20 that we made hires go through. They could be an 80/20 training workshop that you do every quarter or every year or some kind of cadence with the teams, but the training element has to be there. And you need it to be part of the compensation program. You cannot compensate people on stuff you don't want to do. If your compensation is tied evenly to A&B customers or A&B products, it's not going to be a long-term 80/20 company. So I think those are to me, the three biggest items.
The only thing I would add to that is it becomes stale if you use 80/20 as a tool to become the best version of who you are today. If all you do is cost out, optimization, squeeze profit, and that's all you do, it becomes stale. If we don't connect it to how do I transformatively grow and become the best company I can be, not just the best version of who I am today, then it's not stale. All of a sudden, it's entrepreneurial. You have a
Right.
million GMs pursuing entrepreneurial growth adjacencies in your business that are, developing this pipeline of talent in the career, and your business is growing. So try to apply it not just to the best version of you, but a transformative growth.
Well, that was great. Thank you, ladies. I am going to quickly share your contact information in case anyone has follow-up questions they'd like you to answer directly. And I really want to thank both of you. You were incredible hosts. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your insights with us today. I think that the practical strategies and your examples were exactly what our audience needs to hear. So this is the end of today's session, and hopefully you liked what you heard, what you saw, and we can do this again. To everyone who joined us today, thank you so much for your engagement and for the great questions you submitted either in advance or during the session. I know we didn't get to answer all of them during our time together, but don't worry, we will reach out to address the questions that we weren't able to cover today. If you found value in today's discussion, I'd encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn. That's where we share our latest thought leadership, industry insights, and announcements about upcoming webinars like this one. So thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next session from all of us at Strategex. We hope you focus on what truly matters.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.